FBI and CIA agents of Reddit. What's something that you can tell us without killing us? Story 1. There's a book called The Moscow Rules. It was written by 2 CIA people all about, well, disguise. The CIA had all these agents in Russia, but the Russians were insane about following literally every single American in Russia 24/7 looking for spies. So a huge part of their job was trying to shake off the Committee for Safe Security. They had crazy quick-change disguises and all sorts of stuff. And the movie Argo was based on one of the writers somewhat. Wait, really? That's kinda cool. And negotiated huge deals with the Russian government. I was tailed 24/7. One time, I didn't like the room the hotel gave me. I knew I faced the noisy side because I stayed there all the time. And instead of giving me a new room, it was a 90-minute wait while they bugged a new room for me. Twice I had a bizarre run-in with a pushy, very hot, in quotations, woman who allegedly wanted to screw me so bad. Even if I was straight, hot in Russia is a mix between a Bratz doll and a hooker, so no thanks. Same with China. You can only go with blank phones every now and then. Your phone will do this little glitch as if it's being accessed. Story 2. If you go through the FBI interview process, it takes a while. Chances are you're gonna have to spend some time working on crimes against children, which is really tough and most people don't want to do it. Yeah, understandable. I heard a story here on Reddit about how somebody was involved in a case against like a predator or something, and he had to go through every image on his hard drive to flag anything that was child porn. I hate it. That case just drove him out of the industry. I can't even imagine. I read an article once about how the government has people whose job is to look at disturbing videos and images from the internet, and they seized hard drives. Mainly of child pornography, but also things like executions and to find clues and locations, the identity of the people involved, etc. It's an important job, but the burnout rate is astronomical. A lot of them end up with PTSD, addiction issues, and other problems. Story 3. Not CIA, but I've worked with and know guys in intelligence. Most of the intelligence we get is from OSINT, open source intel, i.e. news articles, press releases, news networks, and government announcements. Most people think that everyone in intelligence is some James Bond/Jason Bourne type of individual, when in reality the majority of analysts just sit at a desk and go through news articles all day, really. That said, that's not the only method we have to gather intel, but that is where most of it comes from. Even analysts that are using other methods such as geospatial intelligence, imagery intelligence, and signals intelligence spend most of their days cropping images for minute details or replaying and monitoring the same signal over and over again. Story 4. Worked with a woman who was former National Security Agency. We would always beg her to tell us stuff, but she never did. The one thing she did say, though, was that during training they show him a video of a bunch of things that they found out and stopped. She hardly slept for 2 weeks after watching that, apparently. Yeah, I'm not even gonna imagine what the hell they showed her. Anyway, I have a relative that retired from the National Security Agency a few years ago. She talked about a few things in generalities, nothing specific. Among them, however, you will see things that entirely change your view of the world. People go in there all the time with lofty goals of changing things, and within months those goals are mostly gone. Still, if you want to change things, you work for the agency. If you just want to make money, you work for a contractor. No one cares what contractors have to say. Most people that stay long enough will do a tour of counter-terrorism. Many people transfer after like a few months, and the average stay is 2 years because of the visuals. Those who stick around for a long time often change for the worse, and many struggle with mental illnesses, become alcoholics, get divorced, and genuinely just lead to miserable lives with their work as the only reason of continuing. Hell, alcoholism in general is just rife in the agency. When you cannot speak to anyone outside the agency about your work, it becomes nearly impossible to confide anyone close to you. Even if you have close work friends or family, you have to be careful what you say because not everyone is read into every program. 2 people can sit next to each other in the same office, work on the same subject for months, and never talk about it with each other even though they're close friends outside of the agency. So, people turn to the bottle. Her husband worked for a different government agency and has also had a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance, but she couldn't talk about her work with him, nor could he'd be with her because, he didn't want to involve the intelligence community. The agency employs psychiatrists who are cleared to be read into almost any program. Going to them, though, is often seen as a mark of shame among the other agency employees, so they are not used as nearly as they should be. She told me most of these things while trying to recruit me. She believed that I should go in knowing and what to expect. I eventually declined to apply. Story 5. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but a mentor who definitely wasn't supposed to tell me used to be a white hat for the FBI. Apparently, all he did was search for pedophiles by tracking child porn. He said he didn't stay for very long because it was messing with his mentality, which is very much understandable. He left to join the Navy instead, became a nuke EM, but they pulled him out of the program because of his cybersecurity skills, and before I left our command, he was helping our civilian-military cooperation connect his computer to a projector. Sorry that I had to put you in the spotlight, EM1. Story 6. Operation Ivy Bells was a plan to tap Soviet communication lines. The cover story that they used was that they had divers diving down to recover fragments of a new Soviet supersonic anti-ship missile. The communication line tap was a failure due to a spy. However, the dive team successfully recovered all the fragments of the missiles from the Soviet weapons tests. The US was able to reverse engineer one and subsequently learned that they were radar-guided only and assumed IR guidance did not exist. This is a lot of technical shit that I'm not understanding. But anyway, the tap was successful, and recordings were recovered by dive teams over many months. The tap was ultimately discovered by the Soviets because of the information provided to them by Ronald Pelton, the spy you mentioned. Story 7. 2 family stories, even though this will probably get buried. Well, clearly not, because I'm reading it. Anyway, number 1. My father's uncle told everyone for his entire life that he worked at a button factory. It was only revealed after his death that he, in fact, worked at a missile factory and assembled the gyroscopes for the guidance in missiles. And number 2. We always knew my grandfather worked for the government at the Pentagon. We never knew what exactly he did, but every 6 months or so he would call up to talk to my mum. The conversation was pretty much the same as always. My mum and grandfather would catch up for a few, then it would turn into... So I have another clearance upgrade coming up. You'll probably get a call like always, just wanted to give you the heads up. Sure then sure, a week later some government agency would call up, it was always a different one each time, and ask for my mum. They would ask a bunch of questions, and that would be that. When he died from Alzheimer's at his funeral, 4 men in black suits attended, and no one knew who they were. After the burial, they approached his widow and handed her a plaque with 17 government agency symbols on it. Turns out he was responsible for the interagency cooperation and training. Now, basically, everyone got to talk to each other. Now his son works for him, doing what? We don't know, and we don't ask. Story 8. I once rented out my old farmhouse to a family. They paid the rent every month, and other than not mowing the lawn to save their life, I didn't think anything bad about them. That all changed when the DEA called me to inform me that my renter had been murdered in Mexico and was asking my permission to search for the property. Well, it turns out I had unknowingly rented my house to a Mexican mob, and they were using it as a safe house. It all fell apart for them when 2 of them got caught with a duffel bag full of meth. My renter had to go back to Mexico to visit his mother and was promptly murdered. Let's just say I am no longer a landlord and never will be again. You didn't even bother to ask if he worked for a Mexican cartel? Jeez, dude, come on. Story 9. You want to work for them? Be prepared to do a fair amount of paperwork. The form will ask for each of your employer's contact information, the contact information of your friends, your history of addresses, etc. They will then send an agent to interview a number of these people. Next, you have to take a psychological exam and be interviewed by a psychologist. Finally, you'll have one last interview with a polygraph and a professional lie detector. Wow, that sounds like fun. Story 10. I talked with some CIA recruiters towards the end of college and almost applied earnestly after a large Q&A and then a much smaller one. The thing that stuck out to me was that the guys said that most CIA agents are just out of shape and have limited combat training with guns or hand-to-hand. They made it clear that it's the military that uses force. If confronted, they would train to immediately surrender or drop their bags and run if possible. Jesus, alright. Well, my sister is an intelligence officer who was assigned to special forces, operating in Afghanistan for, just a period of time. She had to go through a gun qualification course and failed. This meant that she was not allowed to carry a firearm while deployed, which is probably for the best. The instructor told her that she was one of a very select group that was so bad at shooting that they could just not pass, and jokingly gave her a knife to carry. She spent the deployment doing whatever she does, some sort of analysis, and then hanging around the gym so she could watch buff guys just force lift. She is thirsty, I'm telling you now. Story 11. When I was 16, I became very close, very fast friends with this guy in my school choir. His dad went on business trips for his work at Lockheed Martin 3 or 4 times a month, always to Chicago. This kid who was my friend, we went everywhere together for about 3 months after being very casually acquaintances for like 2 years. After school, we'd hang around until 10 p.m. or so almost every night, and we'd get lunch at the same time at the same place. We switched our class schedules to be in the same history or language arts sections together, etc. Just your basic nerdy dudes finding a kindred spirit, if you will. I guess our sudden friendship raised an eyebrow or two, because one day my friend came to school and said that his dad were asking him lots of questions about me, who my parents were, what my house was like, did he ever meet my siblings, and if I was an obedient student or if I was snarky. My buddy suspected the questions were being relayed from his dad's boss. Story 12. Not either of those, but I've had clearance, so I can weigh in a little. 2 things. Firstly, the most secret stuff happens right in front of people's faces under the guise of being normal everyday stuff. Secondly, properly secret programs and operations are never named in any way that indicates what they're actually about. They're generally just 2 words chosen at random, and they would rarely come up in a normal conversation, like cracked gorilla, which I just made up off the top of my head. So when people talk about classified stuff, it's a name that is super topical, and it's either very, very old or just a nickname at best. Only public programs and operations have topical names such as PR Motive, like Desert Storm. Story 13. I was in the sauna at my gym when this naked old man with extremely long testicles started talking to me. Somehow the conversation ended up on the topic of my new roommate, who happened to be Saudi Arabian. He then proceeded to tell me if he worked for the FBI and knew exactly who I was, and asked if I would make him some money every now and then for giving him information. I said, sure. Not because my roommate was sketchy, but because he got drunk one day and he pissed on my couch. This was 10 or so years ago, and I never really heard from him, but I think my phone was tapped for a short span of time. Story 14. I have a few friends that are CIA officers. First things first is that people who work for the CIA are not CIA agents, they are officers. The people that they recruit to spy for them are agents. Also, going on a tangent, I'm 90% sure I've been one of those agents when I was dealing with a Mexican logistics company whilst working at General Motors. The logistics company we were dealing with was owned by this multi-billion-dollar Mexican clan, and all the ultra-wealthy clans in Mexico have ties to various cartels. So, some federal agencies got involved. Mainly FBI and I believe a few DEA, but one guy was specifically not wearing any badges, was not willing to identify what agency he was working for, and questioned me a lot on specific details of what the company's capabilities were. Though, getting back on track, anyone who is a US citizen can apply to join the CIA. It really isn't that hard. If you have just about any computer science degree, or a degree in statistics, or engineering, or accounting, and don't have anything that would screw up and you got a clearance, getting a job would be relatively easy though. And, as implied with that previous comment, working at the CIA is far more boring than you would think. Lots of tracing manufacturing capabilities, and from what I described with that Mexican logistics company, to finding out how China sources the components they use to manufacture their satellites. Story 15. My ex was married to an FBI agent and was told many times about the insanely long interview period. She mentioned that they went back to even interview his kindergarten teacher. She also told me if there were truly anyone in your life that was a CIA agent, you would never know. They were being conspicuous. They would truly be sworn to secrecy, and there would never be an instance of them casually mentioning or bragging, "Hey, I used to work at the CIA." Those people don't actually work for the CIA. Story 16. My sister-in-law is involved with these organizations. She can't tell us much about what she does, but she has a large backpack with a radio phone on top. If the phone rings, she's told us not to answer it. You just drop everything and get out of town as faster than ASAP. What if the phone calls and it's just like, "We've been trying to reach you regarding your car's extended warranty." Story 17. Not CIA or FBI, but I work for the Department of Energy in their property management. Not really much of a secret, but the amount of wasteful spending I see every day would make anyone angry about where the taxpayers' dollars are going. And we're nowhere near as bad as the Department of Defense, but it still makes me upset sometimes. They'll spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on one day on some items, just to throw them away the next day because they didn't like what they bought. One example, they bought new keyboard holders for people's desks. Not just a few of them to test them, however. I'm talking over $100,000 worth of keyboard holders. So they got them, tried one out, and didn't like it, so they sent it to my department to be just thrown out and destroyed. And this is a daily occurrence, with things much more expensive. If you're sitting there wondering, what's the most expensive single thing I've ever had to destroy? It was $1.7 million. Why did we have to destroy it? They just wanted something different. It still worked just fine. Oh well, I get to be employed and play with some fun toys they throw away. Ha ha! Story 18. Somewhat unrelated, but my great-uncle was an FBI agent. Every time we would ask him if he ever had anything interesting like stories or so, but he would say he was sworn to secrecy. After 10 years of hearing this, my sister asked, "Really?" And he replied with, "No, I just don't remember anything interesting happening." Story 19. I worked with the Australian Federal Police with the Spider Squad doing computer stuff for them in regards to finding pedos and finding trafficking victims. It is the most heartbreaking work, but when you get them, the office looked like NASA after a Mars landing. Story 20. My aunt has been an FBI agent for 25 years. The only thing I know about her job is that she's an office administrator. But her information went public somehow when she was part of the team that investigated the Mandalay Bay shooting in Las Vegas. Someone found the name and addresses of most of the agents that worked the scene and put it up online. Not sure why. She also took me and my family on a tour of the Las Vegas FBI headquarters about 15 years ago now. One interesting thing that I remember about the buildings was that all the doors were floor-to-ceiling, 9-foot doors. I just thought that was weird. Story 21. My dad worked for the GCHQ in the 80s doing some voice recognition, and he can't say anything more for a decade. Well, the way they can recognize you by Siri Google today was used in the 80s. Just a bit slower. Story 22. Not an FBI or a CIA officer here, but my sister is a district attorney, and over the years she has prosecuted a number of animal cruelty cases. This led to her having an ongoing partnership with the FBI for the last several years. It turns out the FBI started tracking animal abuse cases about 10 to 15 years ago due to the incredibly high correlation between abusing animals when you're young and becoming a serial violent offender as an adult. Story 23. Met an old, retired CIA spook at a wedding reception. Spitting image of Colonel Sanders. He was amazing. So I asked him, "I don't want you to tell me anything you can't, but I'd love to know when Kennedy got killed. What was the talk around the water cooler in the office?" He didn't halt or pause to think. "Hell, we all thought Johnson did it." Story 24. My high school girlfriend worked for the National Reconnaissance Office after college. At the time, they were responsible for analyzing the nation's spy satellite photos. She told me 2 things. There's a special garbage chute for classified materials. It's in the hallway. When you are new, a hazing ritual, they tell you have to shout out your badge number down the chute before throwing in any materials. This is hilarious. She wouldn't tell me anything about the resolution quality of the spy photos, of course. But she did let it slip that because Russian sailors will sunbathe nude on their decks of the submarines in the Black Sea, several women in the office would pin those photos up in their cubicles as beefcake photos. So a few decades ago, US spy photos could resolve the Russian penis. Story 25. Brian Bendis, creator of Miles Morales, author of House of M, etc., I cannot wait for Spider-Man 2 this year, has a story about doing a talk at GBCI at Langley and being told to wait in the break room, not allowed to have his laptop, phone, his notebook or pen, but where he was applied with a notebook during the interview, and when he walked in that he'd be reviewed when he left. A young analyst walks in for coffee, sees him sitting there, recognized him as a famous comic book author Brian Michael Bendis, and starts to react like a fan. He then pauses, starts sweating, and quietly asks Bendis if this is a test of some kind. Story 26. While in college, 1978 to 79, this textbook in my poli-sci class told of a time when Nixon was in office and demanded to leave the White House to go to a musical. Unplanned, no prep for anything, major disaster, Secret Service. Eventually they got Nixon to calm down and they never went out. One of our close new neighbors happened to work for the Secret Service. His family came over to our family home for dinner one evening. Eventually, it came out he worked on the Nixon detail a few years back, and that's when I shared the story I read in my textbook. He actually almost dropped his fork and stayed there with his mouth wide open. Apparently, the story was not only true, but it was supposed to be a secret. I showed him my book, and he notated the author. I have no idea the outcome, but it made the night even more interesting. Story 27. My dad works for a 3-letter organization, and this day, I still have no idea what he does. It's so funny, growing up not knowing what my dad did. It felt normal. My dad would leave for a week, be home for a week, leave for 2, home for 3. He always had a present for me whenever he came back from whatever country he was in. All in all, it never really struck me as odd as a kid. It wasn't until I was an adult that it really did stick out as abnormal. But now, to answer your question, he has only ever told me one thing. Every so often, he'll send me a text, even now as a grown 30-year-old, change your passwords. And I always do, without question. Story 28. I did an internship at the CIA for my senior year. Something to be aware of, the vast majority of people here are probably lying. When you sign on to work for the CIA, anything you say about working there must go through a review process where they can either approve or deny what you'd like to share. This agreement is in place for the rest of your life. This is something I got approval to share. The CIA doesn't blackmail people for information. They might pay you or give you some benefits, but their inside people aren't under duress. This is not the case for many foreign intelligence agencies. Story 29. I interned for a year with the Joint Intelligence Services in the UK, more or less the equivalent to the CIA in the US, doing a year out at university. I was offered a job upon graduation, but I turned it down to work in a more private sector for more money. First things first, it's quite a bit more boring than people think. It's effectively a regular office job if you work in the surrounding infrastructure without direct contact with sensitive material. It's just a large organization that has a different core goal than normal profit-oriented organizations. I can't actually talk about the things that I worked on, but trust me when I say it's not very interesting and it all sounds like very average corporate work. Very normal atmosphere, quite a young crowd, office parties, etc. were still a thing. I worked in a cool building too, effectively known as the Donut. The interesting stuff is actually all about the recruitment process and the rules about working there. The recruitment process was very in-depth in terms of vetting, multiple job tests, family history, and questionnaires alongside the normal interviews and applications. I believe if you had dual citizenship, British/anything else, you actually had to renounce the other citizenship to even accept an internship there. Because of the nature of the hiring process and how difficult it is, job mobility within the organization is very free-flowing. I didn't get to experience that part as I didn't take a permanent job, but I'm told you could very easily switch between departments or even transfer between branches. You were not allowed to tell anyone that you worked for the organization other than your immediate family and your partner. You were told to tell people that you are working for the civil service, and to be unspecific about which department. You were not allowed to refer to M15, M16, GCHQ, Joint Intelligence Services, by name in any conversation outside of closed doors. You could only call it the organization, even in interviews. You could not discuss your work with anyone in your life, not even your family. If they ask how your day was, you cannot go into specifics. So, if you know anyone who says they work for the civil service, but doesn't really go into much detail, it's possible that they work for the intelligence services. In fact, if you suspect a dead relative of yours worked for the organization during their lifetime, there's a service that they offer to confirm that this is for you, though they'll only tell you if they're dead. The job also paid surprisingly well. As an immediate year student, I earned nearly $27,000 for my 12-month internship. Some of my friends took internships at prestigious investment banks which paid less in the same year. The job offer, immediately out of uni, was nearly into the 40s. I haven't had to fire up my CV yet since doing it, but I'm told I'm allowed to state vaguely my job role on it, but not to be too specific and obviously not discuss it on sensitive topics. Overall, 10 out of 10, would recommend. It's a good place to work, the benefits are good, and it's interesting work. Don't pursue something like this if you're in for the clout or the action, though. There is no action, and you're literally not allowed to tell anyone that you work there.